Hi, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, your host for the Civics Connection. Today we're talking about life as a U.S. Senator. Joining me is Democrat Byron Dorgan, who represented North Dakota from 1992 to 2011 in the U.S. Senate, and as the representative at large in the U.S. House from 1981 to 1992. Senator Dorgan, what would you say are the most important changes that you saw in Congress during your lengthy tenure?
Well, how much time do we have? I mean, this is a period of time when I think there have been some of the most dramatic changes in the American political system that I've studied or been a part of, certainly. I came to the Congress in 1980. That was a time when Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House, Bob Michel was the Republican leader. They golfed together, they spent weekends together, they liked each other a lot, and it showed. In the House, in the work of the U.S. House, was a lot of harmony, trying to figure out what do you do together to move the country ahead. Fast forward 30 years, and you know, this is the noise of democracy is like fingernails on a blackboard. I mean, it's just it's not how do both parties come together to get the best of each rather than the worst of both, but it's how do you defeat the other side? And what is your bleacher section, the Rush Limbaughs and all the folks on the radio and television stations that are cheering them on to be more aggressive and more angry? What do they think of what you're doing? It's just, politics has changed a lot, and the country is worse off for it, because what our country needs at the moment is some very important nurturing by the political system, making good decisions about putting the country on track and moving the country ahead.
And what do you think among those changes? You talked about issues about civility and partisanship and the media. Which one of those do you think sort of has contributed the most to these changes that you're talking about?
Boy, you know, I think the growth of the bleacher section that watches politics every day and then imposes judgments and imposes a pretty substantial burden on people that don't meet the expectations of the bleacher section. And then I'm talking about you know, the growth of talk radio, in which the language has become very aggressive, and they're saying, look, you're on our side or we'll get you. And if you go to the Congress and decide you want to compromise, that's a four-letter word. You go to Congress and stand up for your principles, and don't you ever compromise, ever. I mean, that's what's being insisted by those who are watching Congress and trying to impose their will on Congress. And it is, I think that's had a profound impact on the way the behavior in Congress exists, and the difficulty in getting people together to say, all right, we feel differently about things, but where can we find common ground? Because the lubrication of democracy, particularly in Congress, is to find a way to get together and then move forward and move the country forward.
And do you think that this change is more pronounced in the Senate or the House?
I think it is in both places now. It's a change that permeates the entire Congress.
So even though one has a two-year term and one has a 6-year term, and so many people say that particularly members of the House are constantly running for re-election, and senators might be able to take a little bit of a break.
Maybe so, but I think in the Senate there's a continual need to raise funds because the Senate elections have become so unbelievably expensive. I mean, you know, what happens is politicians become revenue collectors for television stations by and large.
Right.
Raise a lot of money, send it over to a television station, put your 30-second message on that either touts you or just attempts to cut the legs off your opponent, one or the other, and that's the way the system works. Now, when I ran for the U.S. House in 1980, I was trying to remember how much I spent. Not very much. I mean, I remember the biggest moment in terms of fundraising, and I had made a friend some years before that, Harry Chapin, the singer. And Harry Chapin came to North Dakota, did a fundraising concert for me, and raised, I think, $16,000, which was huge, huge amount. Harry was a great, great guy. And, I mean, he flew out from New York, wouldn't even allow us to pay for his plane ticket, and sat for 3 hours, filled a stadium of 2,400 people, and sat and played music. And I raised $16,000. You remember Harry Chapin at all? Cats in the Cradle, Taxi, all that great music?
I have his CDs in my car.
But anyway,
absolutely.
And Harry was tragically killed about 6 months after that in 1981. But my point was that we had to raise money in 1980 to run for election to the U.S. House. Running for the election of the U.S. House these days is dramatically different. You've got to raise $1 million, $2 million, $4 million or more for a House seat. And the Senate seats have escalated in price, and so the fundraising is pernicious. And frankly, I decided that some while ago we've got to get to public funding for campaigns somehow, some way.
And do you think that your campaigns, now since you were a representative at large, you ran statewide every time. But did your campaigns have sort of a different feel to them when you were running for the House versus the Senate? Not
in North Dakota. I mean, I was an at-large congressman, which meant that my district was the entire state. I became a senator. My jurisdiction was the entire state. Not very much difference for me. North Dakota.
Even in your campaign strategy or anything like that?
Well, the campaigns are more aggressive on the Senate side because they're more national in scope, and people around the country say, all right, here's a race we can win if we pump some money in. So the campaigns are more aggressive, but by the time I was running for the Senate, I had developed a skin about that thick, which was really important for a politician.
Absolutely.
I mean, I come from a town of 300 people, high school senior class of 9 students. I was in the top 5. I won't tell you where. But the quilt work of the Senate for me, and I tell people in colleges where I teach, the quilt work of bringing people from every corner and every facet of this country to one chamber to be able to come together and make judgments is really important. I mean, I sat next to Dianne Feinstein from California, Joe Lieberman from Connecticut. It's a very different experience that they come from than someone from farming country in a small town of 300 people raising cattle and horses. So that's the genius of this democracy, to bring people from every center to come together and represent the values of America.
Now, one of the statistics that we hear so much is that there's such a high re-election rate in Congress. It's usually over 90%. We know that the election of 2010 was quite different from that. But you announced on January 5th, 2010, so many months before the campaign might have geared up hotly, that you had decided to retire from the Senate. What compelled that decision?
I thought about it a lot. For months and months and months, I questioned that issue. I mean, first of all, the United States Senate is very hard to get to, very hard. And it's also very hard to leave. You sign a line in a book when you sign into the Senate, and I was 1,802. Since the beginning of America, I was the 1,802nd U.S. Senator from a town of 300 people. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary.
Wow.
It's very hard to get to the Senate. Very few Americans have ever had the privilege. But it's hard to leave, and most people elect not to make the decision to leave. For me, I have served 30 years in the Congress, and I wanted to have another chapter of my life to do other things. And also it's the case that if your nourishment from public service is to feel important, I tell you, you get a lot of nourishment being a senator. You feel really very important. And so that nourishment always continues. But if your nourishment is accomplishment, boy, it's a pretty threadbare nourishment these days, because not much is being accomplished, regrettably. I wish I could say differently, but it's this country has been through the deepest recession since the Great Depression, and it needs a lot of help at the moment. But the way the political circumstances of our country are not allowing the kinds of decisions that should be made. And so I didn't leave because I was angry or upset or thought the Congress was worthless, or I thought my stay there was worthless. I left principally because I'd served 30 years. I've watched people stay too long and serve too long, and I wasn't going to be one of them. Plus, there are a lot of other things in life that I'm doing now that I really wanted to do. So I think of this as a great gift and a great privilege that I had for 3 decades, but I'm off doing other things that I think are also contributing to the public good.
Now, how did your constituents and how did the Democratic Party respond to this announcement?
Well, you know, obviously, my constituents in the Democratic Party were heartbroken. You know, they sort of think these things last forever. I'm sure. I
mean, you had constituents who were born while you were in Congress, and so they only knew you as their member of Congress.
But let me tell you something. The first year I was in the U.S. House, I had the opportunity to appoint people to the military academies, West Point, Naval Academy, Air Force Academy. my first year of appointees, turns out my last year in the United States Senate, some 30 years later, someone that I'd appointed to one of the academies had already retired as a colonel.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, I'm thinking to myself, well, it's really time for me to do some other things. But I'm sure there were some opponents in politics in North Dakota who applauded my decision not to run. I didn't have an opponent. When I announced I wasn't running, there was no announced opponent at that point. And had I run, I think I would have been reelected. But I think a small state like North Dakota has a lot vested from getting seniority from their members of Congress. And I was a senior member and chairman of various committees and subcommittees. But I think North Dakotans also understood. North Dakotans are wonderful people. I was very privileged to represent them.
Now, one of the things I asked you about, Senator, was sort of how Congress has changed. And how have the relationships changed between Congress and the executive branch during your 30 years in Congress?
I think those relationships depend wholly on personalities. Mm-hmm. I was there when Ronald Reagan was giving his inaugural speech in January 1981. That seems like a long time ago.
Yes. I
sat behind him, and I remember his speech. The sky opened up and shafts of sunlight came through. It was a cold day and overcast, and as Ronald Reagan was speaking, this new president, the sky opened up and the sunlight came through. And I thought, man, this is going to be a long 8 years, because everything is managed pretty well. But it always deals with the particular personality of the president and whether or not they care about the Congress. Those who reach out to the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, and work with the Congress get along a lot better than those who decide, you know what, I'm president, the Congress doesn't matter, and we're going to have a lot of fights. But I have had the chance to know and meet a lot of presidents, and I think everyone that gets to the Oval Office gets there because of some particular set of skills. I mean, these are people of considerable talents, and so I've enjoyed the relationship with all of them, and I think most of them do better when they decide Congress is a separate branch of government, but nonetheless a partner in what we have to do together to move America forward.
And so that partnership is more about personalities than parties, would you say?
I think it is, yeah. I mean, I've watched Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, and when they decide, okay, we're going to go find some middle ground here, and I'm going to find members of both political parties in the House and the Senate to join me on this middle plateau, that generally is a precursor to getting things done. When, on the other hand, you decide, look, here's my position, and I'm going to fight for that position and insist on it, generally speaking, it takes a long time to get anything done, and you may never get anything done because compromise is a lubrication of progress.
Absolutely. And did you find, for example, that there were presidents who handled this relationship differently in their second term than in their first term?
Oh, yes. Well, Bill Clinton is a good example. Mm-hmm. I mean, Bill Clinton had a pretty rocky first term. Actually, now that I'm speaking, I'm thinking he had a pretty rocky second term, at least in some respects, with the impeachment trial and so on. But virtually every president that is, and Ronald Reagan is an example as well, every president has a kind of a learning curve to try to figure out how do you deal with this Congress, which is a separate branch and an equal branch, which is very important to understand. It takes a while, but you have watched, I'm sure, President Obama. He's doing a pivot to make some very substantial changes in the way he's governing after his first 2 years. Bill Clinton did the same. Ronald Reagan did the same.
Right. So it sounds very interesting that these relationships, which were set out in the Constitution, as you say, it was really intended to be a partnership. We focus so much attention on the checks and not the balances, right, on the negative and not necessarily the positive, that's very helpful insight in all of this.
Yeah.
I regret that we are out of time. I've been speaking with Senator Byron Dorgan, who represented North Dakota from 1992 to 2011 and served as North Dakota's Congressman at Large from 1981 to 1992. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, and this has been the Civics Connection.